Welcome to the Word in Your Ear. We're constantly in a process of living and learning in these strange times. Normally, Word in Your Ear is taking place in the stable surroundings of the Islington in London, swinging Islington in person. But obviously we can't do that at the moment. And so I'm delighted to say that roughly about the same time we would ordinarily be welcoming a guest in the Islington, we can welcome Joe Banks to this special online Word in Your Ear. Joe, if Joe looks slightly glowing, viewers, this is because he's had to just relocate this whole thing from the top of his massive house down to the basement to be near the roof. It's all right. I won't read it. It's not worth it.
And drink several bottles of lager on
I've already had 3 bottles of lager on the process.
Right. Just to get into shape. To talk
about, have a signal.
About his book.
You look crystal clear. That's fantastic.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So Joe's book, to give it its full title, is Hawkwind, Days of the Underground, subtitled Radical Escapism in the Age of Paranoia. And it's out now, Joe. Is that right? It is out now.
Okay, so just a little bit on that. So here is the book. Oh, it's
right there it is. Because we've only got virtual copies.
We've only got virtual copies. This is the hardback. There was a hardback special edition which was released by the publisher last month of a run of 500 copies, and that's actually now sold out. That's hardback, and it came with all kinds of gubbins. The paperback should be available in the next 2 to 3 weeks, despite what Amazon says at the moment. If you go on their site, it's claiming that it's out of stock and may never be in stock ever again. But it's actually hasn't officially been released. But it is going to be available in 2 to 3 weeks. It's actually on a ship from Estonia at the moment. It was printed in it's printed in Estonia, and it has to go all the way to New York to then go to Penguin's Global Distribution Centre. And it's then probably going to be distributed mostly back to the UK, but that's unfortunately
the most analog thing I've ever heard in my life.
It is. It's not wonderful. The air miles are not good there. Yeah.
No. Grief, that's extraordinary. Joe, we have a traditional question we always ask people when they're first our guest on Word in Your Ear is: can you describe the music playing machinery that was available in your home as a child? Can you remember what there was? Was there a record player, cassette player, wind-up gramophone, whatever? What was that?
Yeah, so I guess the kind of main thing would be a record player which was in our front room, but it was one of those record players which was disguised as a piece of furniture. It was literally in this kind of large wooden box, so you had to pull down.
Almost a radiogram. Yeah.
It wasn't actually. We had a radiogram, I think, in the dining room, but this was actually like a customized piece of furniture, so a big wooden box, and you opened it up, and lo and behold, there were a load of records, and there was a kind of record player with the arm where it kind of you could stack the records. And so from a fairly early age, I was rifling through my brother's single collections, stacking those up, and yeah, so totally vinyl to begin with.
Right. So when did Hawkwind first enter your life?
Well, I'm the kind of classic case of somebody who has an older brother with an interesting record collection, and so probably from quite an early age, kind of 7, 8, or 9, I would be hearing all this music coming through his bedroom wall, and a lot of it was classic rock groups like Pink Floyd and Deep Purple, Queen. But he had a copy of Warrior on the Edge of Time.
All right.
It wasn't this copy, but this is Warrior on the Edge of Time.
Right.
So okay. And he and that, compared to all of the other music that I was kind of hearing, was something quite different. It was kind of hard to describe, but it certainly wasn't the same kind of strutting, hard-loving riffs of Deep Purple. It was something more mysterious, something stranger. That particular album has a number of spoken word pieces on it, for instance, which is a 9-year-old kind of hearing these kind of quite apocalyptic spoken word pieces with all of the kind of weird, kind of dark ambient backing was actually quite frightening, but very compelling as well. It was one of those albums where I was thinking, even as a 9-year-old, I could tell that there was something different going on here. And so that was my first encounter with Hawkwind. And when I was a bit older and started buying records myself, my brother said, "Oh, you should get Silver Machine." which I got and wasn't particularly impressed with. I was thinking, well, it's a bit like Status Quo, but not as good. But I persevered, and I know exactly. So I persevered though, and we had a local record library, which obviously has some quite enlightened employees, and they had a copy in there of Space Ritual, which is the Hawkwind's live album from 1973, which if you talk to people such as myself, they will tell you was the greatest live album ever made. And again, that is an experience that once heard is never forgotten. It was, again, completely... It was, it's rock music, but it's completely different from the other stuff I might have been listening to at the time, which was, things like Rainbow and Judas Priest and stuff like that. I'm from the East Midlands, and so heavy metal is in my blood. But kind of hearing something like Space Ritual, was just something else. It's a mind-blowing experience, and for anybody who happens not to have ever heard Space Ritual, it's one of those things where, you're in for really in for something kind of different there, not something you'll have ever heard before, I can guarantee. And also that also had lots of spoken word stuff on it as well, which, really emphasized that here was something not like your standard rock gig, not like your standard rock band. And, I won't claim to have immediately had some kind of, Damascus revelation. But after a few plays, it was like, oh my God, yeah, this is it. This is the thing. I've found my thing.
So this is the... You've ever seen them?
Go on.
To what stage did you ever see them?
So the first time I actually saw them, I think, was in 1985. So the book that I've written is specifically about their classic 1970s period, if you like. So I actually didn't see them at the time, but they were still, a kind of, a quite a different experience from any other band that you could possibly go and see in 1985. And so, I saw them, quite a lot around that period for a few years, and then, moved on to other things. But, certainly I think probably from 2000 onwards, I've very much kind of gone back into their path, into their orbit, and, and seen them quite a few times since then, and have just slowly but surely become kind of utterly obsessed with them. Really.
So
certainly that period.
Let's go back to the beginning. The story, they're very clearly associated with one particular patch of London, aren't they?
Yeah. That's right.
Tell us about this. The story begins in Ladbroke Grove.
Yeah, the story begins in Ladbroke Grove. So I guess when you're thinking about the counterculture in Britain, there's it's easy to kind of think of psychedelia on Carnaby Street and maybe kind of King's Road in Chelsea and Soho. But actually, the real action, countercultural action, was happening in Ladbroke Grove in West London, because this is actually where a lot of the bands were living and rehearsing. For instance, like somebody like Pink Floyd did a lot of rehearsals and a lot of early shows in that area. It's because, at the time, Notting Hill now is pretty much a byword for gentrification, but at the time, and it's little better than a slum.
Yeah.
But it did mean that it was possible to get cheap housing pretty much within walking distance of the centre of London. So, you get a lot of kind of art students and people like that moving in, but you also get lots and lots of kind of musicians. And so, Hawkwind were part of that milieu, if you like. And I guess Dave Brock, who is the main guy in Hawkwind, lived around there. He was a busker. He would kind of busk in Ladbroke Grove, as well as, busking to the West End cinema queues. But he gradually, over time, decided that he'd been in kind of psychedelic bands before, blues bands before, but he wanted to do something different. And Ladbroke Grove was the place where he kind of hatched those dreams, if you like. Lots of the other guys who ended up in the band were also in Ladbroke Grove. And then you have what I refer to as the Hawkwind creation myth in August 1969, when they've only really been together for a few months. They're kind of jamming, they're kind of working out their sound. But, already they're quite different from other bands. And I describe them as barbarian psychedelia with all of their kind of raw electronic effects as well. And anyway, they see literally that this gig is being staged in the All Saints Hall in Ladbroke Grove. Basically, the myth is that they go along and they gate crash it and they say, come on, guys, give us a go. we just want to play for 15 minutes beforehand. And the promoter goes, all right, I suppose so. And they play this 15-minute set, and it's 15 minutes of this kind of heavy acid riff rock, quite different from all of the other stuff that's being played at the time. And it just so happens that John Peel is in the audience that night, and he says to the promoter as he's going out, is saying, that first band, you should think about getting involved with them. And the promoter, a guy called Doug Smith, does indeed become involved with them, becomes their manager, and the whole story goes from there, really.
Complete pivot, isn't it? Amazing.
It is. I mean, whether or not that was actually the case, I mean, people subsequently have said, oh, no, we didn't gate crash it. I think we were booked to play that gig. And, it wasn't our first gig.
Let's say it is.
It's like, let's say it is, because,
it's a great story.
Hawkwind are a band with any band with a very strong mythic dimension. It's important that they have this creation myth.
So there were a number of bands in that kind of scene at the time. I don't know. I remember people like Quintessence and so forth.
Yeah.
But Pink Fairies.
The Pink Fairies. Yeah.
Hawkwind really, they survived that, didn't they? Whereas most of these groups didn't. What do you think it was about them, even from early on, that gave them that tenacity?
I think it really is kind of a question of perseverance in a way. I mean, Hawkwind played anywhere. I mean, they played underneath, they played gigs underneath the arches of the Westway. They played any benefit gig going. They didn't just play in London. I mean, from very early on as well, they're traveling out into the provinces and building up a following. And as I said, they fall in with Doug Smith early on, and he is instrumental in very quickly getting them a record deal with Liberty Records, which at the time, which then becomes United Artists. So they kind of very quickly become recording artists as well. And, the first album comes out, and by then they've got a pretty big following. It gets pretty good reviews, and it goes from there. And you're right, though. I mean, in a way, why did they persist and other bands didn't? I mean, Quintessence certainly were a much bigger band at the time when they started, but Quintessence were, very clearly tied to a specific era, if you like, because they were all about integrating kind of Indian ideas and kind of music into what they were doing, whereas Hawkwind were creating something completely new. Right. The point I make in the book continually is there is no other band who sound like Hawkwind in 1969 or kind of in 1975 or even in 1980. They exist in a genre of one throughout the 1970s. But they also had
huge kind of grassroots loyal support, didn't they? Because I get the impression that they're becoming a band of the people, if you like. But a lot of that has to do with the fact that they didn't seem to fit in. They looked like outsiders. And the rock press didn't, I don't remember them really liking them. The rock press were obsessed with this idea of virtuoso musicians. And there weren't any virtuoso musicians in Hawkwind.
Yeah. That is exactly the point.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Hawkwind kind of demonstrate that you don't have to be, kind of Keith Emerson or Rick Wakeman or kind of whatever. You don't have to be a master of your instrument to kind of make music that people like. And it's interesting, that expression of people's band, as you say, that started cropping up a lot in the music press reports, and this is often like a backhanded compliment. It basically says, we don't think you're very good, we don't particularly like your music, but we acknowledge that a lot of people
who don't know any better.
A lot of our readers like you. That's probably what it means, that we don't want to disrespect you too much.
Yeah, exactly.
It is. But I mean, you see that classically also with somebody like Black Sabbath, another band who, sold vast amounts of, kind of albums and played to massive crowds, but the press just didn't really understand why. They couldn't understand why they were popular. In fact, as the 70s progressed, it goes from bemusement to actually outright anger that a band can play this kind of music and attract this level of crowd. It's like, well, why? Why are you going to see it? And this was a real disconnect between the music press and what Hawkwind were doing. And we can talk about this later, but I mean, this is something which feeds directly into Hawkwind's influence then on punk. Because a lot of the people who were going to see Hawkwind, who the music press is saying, we don't understand why you're going to see Hawkwind, were then the people who went on to form the first wave of punk bands.
Now, you'll no doubt be amazed to hear that earlier today, I asked Alexa to play Hawkwind, and what did Alexa choose to play first? Obviously, Silver Machine.
Silver Machine. Yeah.
So Silver Machine is an extraordinary phenomenon, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
Because it's a completely one-off. It was a top 3 hit, is that right?
Yeah, it was at number 3 for a couple of weeks, and it was on the charts for something like 15 weeks. I mean, it sells about 500,000 copies in the UK alone. It goes on to sell 1 million. It's a big hit all around the world.
Oh, really?
Not just in Britain. I mean, it gets the number 1 in Switzerland, for instance. But I mean, it's a big record across all of Europe, in parts of kind of Africa even. It's a hit. But you're right, it's a complete anomaly. It was originally like a live recording, which from the Roundhouse in early '72, which they overdubbed and released, and it enters the charts, I think, in July 1972, purely based on the fact that by this point they're a very, very big underground band, and everybody goes out and buys it. But then people like Jimmy Young and Tony Blackburn start playing it on Radio 1, and before you know it, it's taken off and it's become this absolute phenomenon. And a lot of that, for instance, is to do with the classic clip that you can find online of them playing not on Top of the Pops, but a promo that was done for Top of the Pops in a concert hall in Dunstable, I think it is. And it's incredible, particularly because there's so little footage of Hawkwind in the 1970s, which is another story in itself. But this is an amazing piece of film. And it airs on Top of the Pops the week after David Bowie has done his famous Starman performance, which outrages everybody or kind of converts everybody or subverts everybody. But then you have this the week after. You have this incredible clip of Hawkwind on Top of the Pops, which in my mind probably turned just as many people's heads, maybe not the same people, but it is this idea of the underground suddenly spilling out into your front room for 4 minutes. And it's an incredible piece of film.
Now, the other thing that where does Stacia and so forth fit into this era? Because Stacia was another figure who meant a lot to people who weren't particularly in the Hawkwind camp.
That was a major changing point, wasn't it? Because I mean, suddenly they got all this publicity. And also, you have to admire the fact that they were so kind of, flexible in their outlook. They took, members of their road crew and promoted them into the lineup. And they took Stacey, who I think was just a girl they invited up on stage to dance with them one night. And 2 weeks later, she was virtually in the band. And that's right. Astonishing way. I mean, how many bands did things like that? It was amazing.
Well, this is it. I mean, if you look at it, so so much of the stuff they did was a bit like kind of this guy can play a bit of saxophone, fair enough, you're in the band, or this guy's got this kind of audio generator, which is like a signal testing equipment for radio valves. Okay, yeah, you can come join in the band. And you're right. And then I think Stacia, she herself actually, I think she's met Nick Turner at the Isle of Wight Festival in 1970. And anyway, when they played down in Cornwall in Red Roof near to where she lives, she says, hi, remember me? Can I get up and dance with you? And they say something like, only if you take your clothes off. And she's like, yeah, all right. And, it goes from there, basically. And
hashtag different times. Yes.
Different times, but you're right. God. I mean, Stacia made an enormous impression on kind of a lot of the people who went to see Hawkwind. For obvious reasons in a way, but also because it's another way that defined Hawkwind as kind of different from a traditional kind of rock band. Completely. You have this incredible light show. You have these readings, breaking up songs, but then you also have Stacia who's doing this interpretive dancing, and sometimes she's naked, sometimes she's not, but she's always got incredible makeup and hair and costumes. And I mean, that's just another kind of way that Hawkwind are defined against everybody else. But I guess kind of she really comes into her own after, in the Silver Machine promo, she's actually pretty much the lead figure in it. She's
going to say,
she is.
Yeah, so, but then after Silver Machine, what that enables them to do, because they actually, for once, make a lot of money, is that they can then put on this tour that they've been talking about for a while, the Space Ritual Tour, which is this like multimedia extravaganza, certainly for 1972, where you not only have Stacia dancing, you have a couple of other dancers, you have the most incredible kind of light show, you have the readings, you have people go and there's free programs given out and joss sticks and God knows what else. And this really, really kind of does cement their reputation. It's like nearly 2 hours of almost.
And it's a major piece of kind of rock theatre, isn't it?
Yeah,
and
rock theatre is exactly what it is.
Yeah. What do you think were the newest and most original elements about that stage show?
I think that certainly the lighting and the kind of slide effects that they had was a big deal. There was probably only Pink Floyd who were putting on a light show of that type. So, when in an age when kind of rock bands still played with a few follow spots and some footlights, and that was it. I mean, you're talking about an absolute, kind of barrage of kind of lights and images and very primitive kind of animation and films. And I mean, the whole thing about Hawkwind is that they are certainly at the start against the star trip, as they call it, and so they almost step back from the front of the stage, and they want the imagery, they want the dancers, and they want the light show to be the focus of what they're doing, and they're kind of just providing the music. But then the other big element of Space Ritual is the poems, the readings, and these are by a guy called Robert Calvert. And Robert Calvert drifts into their orbit fairly early on. And, at the start, they're playing this, kind of mantric, riff-focused music. And his friend, Nick Turner, says, well, we play space rock. And he thinks, that's an interesting idea. And he's been writing kind of science fiction stories and poetry. And he basically starts performing with them. And by the time they get to Space Ritual, he has conceptualized the whole thing. It's meant to be this conceptual show about a team of starfarers in suspended animation, and this is meant to be all the dreams that they're having in deep space. And so you've got that as a framing device, but then you've also got Calvert delivering these kind of incredible poems, the most famous one of which is Sonic Attack, a poem actually written by Michael Moorcock, who is another guy who has drifted into their orbit as an ideas man. But Sonic Attack is a definitive kind of Hawkwind track. It's like a parody of a public film, but it's absolutely terrifying, particularly when you think that a lot of people gigs probably would have been on some kind of high, some kind of, the music is one thing, but then suddenly having this guy haughtily reading out this apocalyptic poem and telling everybody, do not panic, think only of yourself, must have been kind of quite something, quite a spectacle, I think.
They were extended, the kind of Hawkwind brand, I'm sure they wouldn't have described it as such, was kind of extended into books, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's the whole multimedia aspect of the show is obviously a very important thing for Hawkwind. But I mean, as I held up before, I mean, if you look at the album sleeves, for instance, that they have these amazing kind of album sleeves.
Yeah.
This is kind of Search of Space, as you see, it's kind of, which you probably can't see, it folds out and then this comes down, and then you have the hawk log inside, which is very important. We'll maybe talk about that in a moment. But so they basically develop what I call a mythos around them. They have this kind of story around them in various kind of sleeve notes and stories that are published in the underground press about them being kind of spacefaring saviors who have come to kind of save the Earth from itself. It's also linked in, I guess, with the whole Eric Van Daniken thing that's happening at the time, the ancient astronauts. And it culminates in a couple of books which are actually written about them, which are, here we go, Time of the Hawk Lords and Queens of Deliria. And so Hawkwind appear in these books as these kind of superhero figures, the last band on Earth in this post-apocalyptic scenario, fighting against the death generator, which is at the Earth's core and has caused all of these bad vibes throughout history to pollute people's minds. And only Hawkwind, as the reincarnation of the mythic Hawk Lords, can combat this. So it's kind of all set in the future, and it's 250 pages of the stuff. And it's quite something. I mean, it's got Michael Moorcock's name on the front, but it was actually this guy, a guy called Michael Butterworth, who was a kind of younger friend of Moorcock, who actually wrote them. And they were the first novels he'd ever written. And I think, as I say in the book, they're kind of a cross between a kind of pulp thriller, a kind of new wave sci-fi novel, and a kind of fans' review of their favorite band. They're quite mind-blowing to read. They're not great literature, but what other bands were having
And
these
that
kind of
shored
books
up-
written
yeah.
about them.
And it shored
Yeah.
up the idea that they were part of some kind of science fiction concept, really, weren't they?
That's right. I mean, that's
how
the
people do
other. That's
space
the other
rock
key
stuff.
element. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the key element of Hawkwind, other than the actual the nature of the music, is also their close association with science fiction.
Yeah.
Robert Calvert, as I say, had written poetry and science fiction stories. Michael Moorcock was one of the major figures in the British science fiction scene, and people like Barney Bubbles producing this amazing science fiction influenced artwork for them. And this becomes both their kind of blessing and their curse. I mean, certainly early on, a lot of people think, wow, this is amazing space rock, amazing covers, man. But as the decade progresses, and certainly once you pass the 70s, for a lot of people, it's a bit like, oh, as Lemmy says, isn't this just Star Trek with long hair? But, good on them. They do something different with science fiction as the decade progresses. I mean, from 1976, Robert Calvert, who leads the band for a bit, but then totally goes back in control. By 1976, he's their frontman, and he starts to have a much more sophisticated take on science fiction, and a lot of his lyrics they're science fiction influenced, but they're very subversive. They're about social comments as well. Really fascinating lyrics. And so, it's not just about aliens and spaceships and robots. It's about something a lot deeper. And I think that was, in the same way that if you think of somebody like David Bowie, a lot of his lyrics in the 1970s are very sci-fi influenced as well. He just kind of perhaps hid it a bit better, but Hawkwind are a bit more overt about it. But it's the same kind of idea.
Do you think that the kind of so-called Krautrock got some of the respect that Hawkwind should have got, but that Hawkwind didn't get because they were British, whereas Krautrock groups, you didn't know what they were on about most of the time?
I think so. It's interesting that people these days kind of sometimes have this kind of revelation and go, well, hang on a sec. Hawkwind sound pretty much like Krautrock, don't they? And it's like, yes, they do. It was actually quite well acknowledged in the early 70s. There were quite a few people who said, well, kind of there's Can and there's Amon Duel, but actually kind of Hawkwind are quite similar. But as you say, quite quickly, and I think the science fiction thing definitely has an influence here, Hawkwind seem to be not hip, whereas people like Can, Amon Duel, as I say, they're a bit more mysterious. They're not singing about kind of science fiction, but the actual music itself is definitely in the same area. But whereas in Germany, you have an entire scene, based around Krautrock, and it stretches from Can and Neu to people like Kraftwerk and Tangerine Dream. In the UK, you don't have anything. You don't have anything like that. The only thing you have is Hawkwind.
But in the 70s, there's a bit you quote from Richard Williams and Melody Maker talking about, in the rush to applaud the Amon Duels and Cans from across the water, we've all tended to forget the profits are our own backyard. So at the time, they were recognised, but that's kind of disappeared now, hasn't it?
Yeah, and, exactly.
So they just don't. They're just not seen to be part of that kind of legacy, really.
Well, I think these days people kind of are acknowledging it more. But Hawkwind have had. Their wilderness years were pretty long. Let's put it like that. Certainly critically speaking. The fans have always been there. They've always been able to sell records. But critically speaking, they were just kind of nowhere for a long time. Whereas, as I say, now you get more of a generation of people coming through who are willing to kind of say, well, yes, absolutely. This is the UK equivalent of Krautrock. Absolutely, it is. But as I make the point, it's so mysterious to me that they were the only band doing this. Krautrock, to say it's become so influential on modern alternative music, has practically no influence on British bands in the 70s until you get right to the end of the decade, and you've got people, kind of like obviously Joy Division and OMD and people like that picking up on the more electronic aspects of Krautrock. But yeah, it's not a thing. People go and see. Can toured regularly in the early 70s in the UK. They had an audience, but nobody went away thinking, great, let's form a band like Can.
That's a good point. That's a really good point.
Why not?
No, I suppose possibly they didn't have the technology. I don't know. It's an interesting point. So, how long have Hawkwind been going? Because they still exist to this day. So what are we talking about? 1967 up to now? Is that fair enough? And in business all that time?
Well, yeah. The official. officially start in '69, but there is a point actually quite interesting. In March 1978, they do a fairly disastrous American tour, and at this point they split up.
Right.
They don't split up for very long, but they do kind of split up, and then they reform a few months later as a band. So they reform as the Hawklords,
right?
And they release this kind of album, which, as you can see, is quite different from kind of the other stuff they've been doing. And but they then become Hawkwind again in 1979, and from that point onwards, yeah, absolutely, they are around releasing music. Even though, from 1982 onwards, they're not on a major label. They're on indie labels. They form their own label. They're currently on Cherry Red. And they've just kept on going, and there's always been a fan base there for them, able to support them. And a lot of that, I think, is to do with this early myth making, if you like, this early sense of the audience being part of the show and being part of the mythos with Hawkwind. So many people bought into that. They just kind of wanted to keep going with it. People sense that this is something different. As I say, they're the alternative to the alternative. They always have been.
Now you get a lot of people talking about. Sorry, just saying that you get a lot of people who are fans of that time talking about, the Vic Reeves, people like that, Johnny Rotten, because Johnny Rotten, when they reformed the Sex Pistols, played Silver Machine, so that's got to help, hasn't it, bringing them back into the frame? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, just kind of people kind of thinking, oh, well, Johnny Rotten was a fan. That was a revelation in itself. But as I mentioned earlier, I mean, a lot of the early punk figures had all been kind of big Hawkwind fans, and not just in London. I mean, you had people like Pete Shelley, who was a massive Hawkwind fan in Manchester Buzzcocks. You had Stephen Morris and Peter Hook from Joy Division were huge Hawkwind fans, and personally, if you listen to some of those, the Joy Division recordings, things like 24 Hours, I think you can hear a Hawkwind influence in there.
Yeah.
And people like Richard H. Kirk, Cabaret Voltaire in Sheffield. So, the electronic side of things had a real big effect. And you suddenly realize that Hawkwind aren't this kind of footnote, but they're an actual integral part of the story of British music in the 1970s, particularly as it goes on to influence punk.
Now, we deliberately kept off the complications of the extraordinary lineups changes over the years, because it would require Pete frame and a huge great wall. A blank wall.
A wall of the family tree. Yes.
Yes, but
39 members, was it? I can't remember.
I think it's more. There was 50. Is it 15? Did you say 59? It's a lot. It's a lot of members.
A lot of members. Yeah.
So who's the key figure nowadays?
Okay, so Dave Brock is still very much the captain of the ship. I mean, from 1980 onwards. I mean, he was always the guy who was the. Excuse me, sorry,
we lost him.
I know. Sorry. So we've literally just got a new puppy, and he was just walking over some of my valuable artifacts, which I must put up here. Sorry. Anyway,
it happens to politicians all the time.
I mean, Dave Brock has basically been the main guy in a way all along, although the band is a lot more communal. Keep away from them. The band has been a lot more communal during the 70s. There's a lot more kind of input from the other members, but from about 1980 onwards, he is the main guy, and he still is the main guy. And he has his own studio down in his farm, his homestead in Devon, and so he's able to just kind of keep on producing music. And he obviously kind of has a band around him, but it's very much kind of Dave Brock's vision these days. Whereas, as I say, in the 1970s, it would probably be somebody like Robert Calvert who overall had the wider vision, even if Brock was still writing most of the music.
Right. So they'll keep going. There will be a Hawkwind as long as there's breath in their body, apparently.
Well, it's an interesting question, because when I spoke to Dave Brock a couple of times during the writing of the book, and I asked him, it was around the same time, I think I just reviewed the last Gong album. Now, if you may know, Gong are another band who they don't necessarily sound like Hawkwind, but they're very much in the same kind of bracket for a lot of people. And David Allen was the main guy behind them. But I mean, he died a few years ago. But he had said to the guys who he was in the band with at the time, "I want you to carry this on. I want Gong to continue." So Gong has continued, and in my, possibly controversial opinion, are a much better band now. I mean, their last 2 albums are absolutely brilliant. I mean, they're stonking albums, but they are a band who've continued without any original members. And they've basically, the idea that Gong is is a concept that can be carried forward. And so I asked Dave Brock this. I said, "Have you?" It's a bit of a difficult conversation to say. Hey Dave, when you die,
when you're dead,
it's all here to continue. But
will the band sound better?
This is what Gong have done. And it was like maybe. So I have a feeling that it is difficult because I think Dave is such a dominant figure within their whole sound and philosophy these days. I think it may be difficult for them to have pulled off what Gong have done, because Gong have also some very strong characters in there who weren't in the original band but have continued the sound. I'm not so sure with Hawkwind, but it is incredible. I mean, Dave Brock is going to be 80 next year.
Oh, really? That's amazing.
There's actually a little short story about or short piece on the new Hawkwind album, or rather the Hawkwind Light Orchestra album in this month's Mojo. And there's a picture of Dave in the studio, and I was actually just showing this to a friend, and I was saying, "Look, there's Dave Brock. He's 79." They're like, "What? You've got to be joking!" And he does look very, very good for his age. He looks like a man, possibly, in his 50s or 60s. So, which is incredible when you think of the amount of abuse that he must have given his body.
They're not. It says a lot for the acid diet that he was on. For God knows how many years.
Because famously, obviously, Lemmy was a member of the band, and Lemmy had this reputation for being Mr. Indestructible.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, could have the Reaper caught up with him. But Dave Brock is the man who literally does seem to be indestructible and almost immortal. I mean, it's incredible because he's. As I say, he's 79, and he's not only looking still very fit, but he's still producing double albums of music, as he's just.
Well, I think it would be the most most in keeping with their kind of alternative mission if they could keep going, even when they all shuffle off this mortal coil. If Hawkwind still keep going. And I hope you'll be there to continue to document it, Joe.
Probably, yes, I'll still be there.
There'll be further volumes, no doubt, to follow this. This story is not over, I'm sure. So the book's called Hawkwind: Days of the Underground, and as soon as that container ship gets over from New York or wherever it is,
Estonia.
When it hits groundfall in New York, it hits the distribution center. 2 or 3 weeks time, everybody can buy it. Yeah,
everybody can buy it. Well, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. And
no problem. Thank you.
And all the very best with it. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Thank you.
Brilliant to see you.